This is our first Networked Ed for the academic year. We had a Networked Edge, which is our sort of provocative debate series where we had Professor Stephen Downs from Canada in July. This is our first Networked Ed for the year. This is, I think, our fourth year of running Networked Ed, and it's a really important part of the way we are engaging with the sector and engaging with the issues around higher education, technology and society. So it's actually very, very great for us to have Josie Fraser here to be our first for this year. And Josie's going to be talking about an area which I think, if you look at the global debate around higher education, digital literacy is one of those critical issues that's been investigated, has been debated, but still is a particular issue for higher education in the way it's been implemented. So I think it's quite prescient that we've got Josie here today, and without further ado, I shall hand over to her.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here today to talk to everybody, and for the opportunity to discuss the project that we've been working on for the last couple of years, which is the DigiLit Leicester project. So my name's Josie Fraser. I'm ICT Strategy Lead for Leicester City Council, and in that role I take responsibility for the technology strand of a very big buildings programme. So it's a high value building programme, one of the highest value programmes we've had in the city for the last 50 years. And it's looking at rebuilding and refurbishing 23 secondary and SEN schools. The majority of those schools looking after young people between the ages of 11 and 16, but some of those schools look after younger learners, and some of those schools have small sixth form colleges too, but the majority of our learners are around that age. And it's a very diverse cohort of schools, so within that there are secondary mainstream schools, but there are also schools for learners with different needs. So there's the Children's Hospital School, there's the pupil referral units, which support learners with behavioural and social and emotional difficulties, and there are also the specialist SEN schools for learners with a range of disabilities, some of which are multiple and severe disabilities as well. So Leicester as a whole is a very cosmopolitan city in terms of the cultural and ethnic diversity of our city. We're one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse cities in Europe. We also have high levels of comparative poverty. About 1 in every 3 of our young people living in comparative poverty. And we also have higher than national average for learners with recognised special education needs as well. So not counting the wide range of learners that there will be that we don't know, that haven't been identified or statemented in terms of their special education needs. There's around 22.4% of our learners have got recognised SEN scores. But obviously the BSF programme is a very positive piece of news against that broader landscape and against those difficulties, because we are bringing amazing new schools and facilities to those school communities, and with that making a huge investment in technology in terms of infrastructure, end user devices, systems, and indeed in terms of staff development, which is the work that we're looking at here. The build programme represents a huge opportunity to the city as a whole, and to learners in the city and to school communities and the broader communities that those schools are situated in. But if we don't focus on supporting staff during that transition time and using the excitement and interest of a new build and new facilities as a lever for looking at our practices in terms of using technology for learning, we're missing a huge opportunity. So this is really informing the project that we're doing. In terms of digital literacy, obviously this is an area that's of interest to all education sectors at the moment, and it is of interest internationally in terms of what do we mean by digital literacy, why is it important, and what are we going to do about it, which is one of the things that I'm really interested in. So for me, digital literacy is important in the sense that if we're saying that literacies enable communities and individuals to access and engage with social, cultural, political and economic structures, and not only to engage with those structures and participate, but actually to shape and develop those structures, then digital literacy at a time when mobile, web-based and gaming technologies are so implicit in everyday life is a hugely, hugely important area. And if we overlook that in terms of our communities, what we're likely to end up doing is exacerbating the already underprivileged or disadvantaged communities who don't necessarily have those skills, whatever age they are, whether they're 60 or whether they're 16, don't necessarily have those skills by magic to be able to use technologies, and they don't necessarily have support networks around them that will enable them to develop those skills. So in that context, school provision is really, really critical to support those young people. So the project is looking at digital literacy, but it focuses on staff rather than students. If you think about digital literacies as a kind of a way of entering into those networks and engaging with those practices, you can see that in terms of the roles that I play or other people play, there are many different kinds of roles that you play, as there are many literacies that you will need. So the literacies that I'll need as a citizen, for example, to access online government services, to be able to do banking online, to do a whole range of things, are pretty core and pretty fundamental. But there's also literacies around the ways that I am as a learner or as a student or as a staff member or as any other kind of professional. So if we break up digital literacy into those kinds of levels, so levels that citizens need to be able to be citizens and actually participate socially, but then acknowledge that there's another layer around that, which is around professionalism and being able to develop as a professional, to utilise technologies to deliver work, but also to continue growing in those areas. That's really what we're looking at. So the project is looking at looking at digital literacy situated specifically in secondary school and SEN practice. And that's kind of our starting point. There's a lot of high-level discussions about what digital literacy is, what it isn't, what it should be, whether it's literacies or literacy, whether it's competencies. There's a huge debate going on around that, which I think is very healthy and very positive. But what we've tried to do with this project is undercut that and work with our community to look at, well, what does it mean in practice? And we've done that for a few reasons. One way is so that we can actually communicate and talk to our constituency and our communities about what digital literacy means in a way that's accessible. And another way is so that we're not just talking at a very high level, but not actually achieving and delivering support and practice that moves communities forward. So some of the key questions the project as a whole has looked at is that what does it look like in practice? What are the current strengths and gaps across city schools? So it's one thing to say, we think digital literacy is this. It's another thing to say is, well, my community is really good at this, my community is really not as good as that. There's very little evidence. There's a lot of anecdotal stuff around what school staff in our communities are good at and what they're not good at, but very little actually asking people as individuals and taking an approach to it. And what we wanted to do is drill down on it so that we've got a picture that looks at individual staff level, the level of individual staff, that looks at school communities and looks at actually what the picture looks like right across the city. And then the third question is obviously, well, how can we support, once we identify where staff are and how they are, how can we support them in moving on from that? So, DigiLit Leicester project was a 2-year knowledge exchange project. I don't know if you're familiar in the room with the knowledge exchange project, but basically we've worked in partnership with Montfort University. Professor Richard Hall has worked as the academic supervisor on this project, and through that mechanism we've worked together to, and we appointed Lucy Atkins, who is the project research associate, to lead on getting the work done in that time. It's been a really, really positive experience for us as a business of using the KEP mechanism. It's been a great way to tap into university resources, practices, access and channels, and deliver the project with that external support, and in partnership with one of our local universities as well. So the core project team of Richard, Lucy and I worked then in partnership with the 23 schools. I think that's been a really key point that we've used as a touchstone right throughout the project. So the schools have been engaged in the process from the very start. We haven't come to them and said, hey, we've got this great thing that you're going to implement that's going to make your lives amazing. We've actually started from the beginning with talking to them. And here's a project timeline, and it's a nice linear project timeline. The project's not linear at all. It's a horrible misrepresentation of what it is that we've done. You'll have to use your imaginations to see it as a kind of a circle with things coming off of it. But we had a 2-year project, so a very tight timeline, and how we framed it is by having discrete milestones within those timelines and then working iteratively around those different milestones. And I'll go through the different areas, but it started off with the development of the survey with staff to talk and check about what those kind of key areas needed to be, and what those, and how to best to express those practices as well in ways that all staff would understand and be able to access. Then went to a first round of a survey that was worked up from that framework, and from that fell out recommendations and a range of school activities. We've completed and we've just put out a report around this year's survey results, and now we're into the kind of next phase now of moving forward in terms of picking up on this year's recommendations and practices. So the survey that we developed, I've already said that it was developed in partnership with the schools. And one of the things I did want to point out here is just the fact that it wasn't developed outside of an understanding of the stresses and constraints that school staff are already working under. So we've got 6 key areas that emerged from the survey, and now that's not because there is only 6 key areas or there's only 6 areas that have got to do with digital literacy, and it could have been expressed in a lot of different ways, and it could have been cut differently, and through the iterations that went on it actually was cut a lot of different ways. But we had to think very pragmatically about the fact that we're developing quite a complex thing, which is a framework that looks at practice as a whole, and then we're creating from that a survey with series of questions in it and statements that we're asking staff to look at. It needed to be manageable. So all of the time while we've been working towards this, we've been very careful to be thinking, what can people actually cope with? What's the limit of people's ability to engage with things? How can we make it as uncomplex and as accessible as possible to people? So from this survey, there came up 6 key areas: finding, evaluating and organising, creating and sharing, both of which are fairly self-explanatory, and both of which are areas that staff are really familiar with, do as part of their everyday practice in terms of finding and using digital resources. Another couple of key areas were assessment and feedback, because we know, assessment and feedback is obviously a huge thing within schools anyway, but also it's one of the areas that we know from research really supports moving learners along, but not necessarily one of the areas that is as supported by technology as it could be, especially in terms of things like peer assessment and peer review. Communication, collaboration and participation was, you'll see from the results, a less familiar area for a lot of staff, but really looks at technologies that have kind of collaborative affordances and the use of things like social networks and social media to support different aspects of learning and communicating. The other two areas were e-safety and online identity. E-safety is obviously a fundamentally critical area for working with young people in digital environments. There's a range of statutory duties that schools have towards their learners, and there's a range of duties that schools have responsibility for dealing with. So, for example, cyberbullying that takes place outside of school computers, could still end up as an issue for the head teacher to resolve. So there's a broad range, and online identity is included there because obviously our focus isn't, in terms of this framework, isn't on learners, it's on staff members. So it's very important. So it's issues around reputation management, but it's also issues around myself as a person who's in a digital space with an online identity and how that relates to my work. And then technology supported professional development, which is obviously about how do I use different technologies to move along all of these kind of areas, but also to move along in areas that are nothing to do with digital or technologies, to move along in terms of, I'm a history teacher, how do I better deepen my knowledge of my subject area, how do I keep on top of the discussions that are going on, how do I have conversations with peers around those areas. So the survey tool that was developed from the framework basically asked staff a series of questions that were statements around their practice. And it asked them to comment on whether they did some of those statements, they did none of those statements, or they did all of those statements. And from that, there was the practice that was talked about was put into 4 different levels in order to organise the information and the data, and also to support staff in knowing where they might be and what the next step might be as well for them. This is reasonably blunt but very useful. So entry level there is staff who typically won't have had much opportunity to use technology at all in that specific context. Core is where we would like to see the majority, if not all, of our staff being, in terms of basic use of different technologies and different approaches within each of those areas. Developer is typically where staff have got specific skills and expertise around specific platforms and tool sets. So they might be fantastic at using one particular tool, but very nervous around using a very similar tool for a similar process. So with skills and competencies perhaps mapped to specific areas or specific tools. And then Pioneer is confidence across a range of different approaches, different tools, and typically as well a lot of the framework positions pioneers as people who are also supporting other people within the school. So they may be producing walkthroughs, they may be doing staff development lessons, they may be the person that you go to if you want to know how to do something as well. Okay, so the first cycle was obviously the survey results came in, and I'm not going to talk about the 2013 survey results that much. I'll talk about them a little bit when I talk about this year's survey results. But the recommendations of that and the framework itself helped to scaffold the activities that took place around that to try and answer that other bit of the question, which was how do we move staff forward. One of the ways that we move staff forward is once they've completed the survey, they're given information about how they scored and what their scores reflect in terms of their practice, and also given information about, well, what does the next level up look like? And also links to ranges of resources that they could pick up on if they're interested in that area. That was really, really effective. Actually, it's quite a simple thing to do, but very, very effective, because we had a lot of staff saying, feeding back things like, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that area before. I'm really interested in that. Thank you for highlighting it. That's what I'm going to look at in my practice in the next step. But it also helped frame our thinking at individuals, departmental and school level, about what are the areas that we would like to drill down on and take forward in various ways. And how we then took that forward was in two different ways. One, activities that we organised centrally and supported schools in, and there was a range of these. One of them, for example, was we worked with China International and 3 of our schools to produce a information pack about supporting learners on the autistic spectrum in terms of e-safety, because there was a big gap there in terms of specific advice and guidance for those learners. So that was a really positive project that we were involved in. Another thing that we did is we had a series of leadership briefings focusing at senior leaders in schools and talking to them and getting people in to talk to them about specific uses of technology that they may not have been aware of. And we covered things like student digital champion programs, for example, was something that we wanted to introduce them to, the ideas about how that might look like in practice. But there's a range of those as well. And then we had a range of school-based and led projects. Okay, the other news was 23% of people put themselves at entry somewhere, which is obviously something that we want to address. Now, some of those people at entry on some of those things, it's going to be more or less important for them, depending on the cohort of learners that they're working with and the learners' needs, and also depending on their role as well. But there was some interesting information, there was some interesting things that fell out about role from the survey that we can talk about later if people are interested in that. One of the other key things that came out is that of the people who took the survey in the first year and the people that took the survey in the second year, we had about 200 odd people who took the survey both years. So we were able to look at what differeces had occurred to that cohort over that time. And this was really interesting because on all 5 areas, so we've got 6 areas. You've seen that for e-safety and online identity, we've got a very high score anywhere. That stayed pretty consistent across the year, but on every other area, we had at least a 20% increase from core to developer. And this is over about an 8-month period rather than a whole year, including school holidays. So we've moved people forwards tremendously in that time. So that's fantastic news. What's perhaps not so great, although it's an area that we're now looking at a bit more, is this entry level area, which has remained stubborn, really. So the movement has been from there to there in the main, but there has been statistically significant movement, which is fantastic news for us. So 43.5% of people put themselves in at the higher level in that e-safety category. Now, in some ways, it's obviously brilliant. In some ways, it's not a huge a surprise as it might first seem, because there's a statutory component to e-safety for schools and school staff. They typically do get training and support over the year. They get inset days that are looking at specific things. If the law changes in some ways, they will get information and support about that. So they are doing and engaged in that area. They are getting support around that area normally. What's interesting, though, is that around communication and collaboration and participation, it was one of the areas where the highest number of people were at the lowest level. Now, if you think about e-safety specifically, a lot of it takes place online, and a lot of it takes place within communities, and a lot of it takes place in settings where collaboration and communication and participation are pretty key. So what that indicates, with the mismatch really of results, is that the way in which e-safety is is being thought about and managed and is playing out in schools is what the EU online survey characterises as protection by restriction. So within constraints of filtering, of blocking, of talking in abstract ways and working in abstract ways around the issues of e-safety.
So is that saying that all of the messaging around e-safety is actually throttling the potential for people to use these tools for communication?
No, I don't think that's it. I think that that this fits in with the wider research that shows the UK young people are one of the most protected young populations in Europe, and that the way that we talk about and engage with them around e-safety is that kind of protection by restriction. It's slightly different from saying that it stops that. It's basically saying that the way that this is approached isn't in those contexts, so that those other contexts aren't valued as much. Does that make sense? You're looking puzzled, so...
No, so this may be the jet lag. It still feels like if what you're doing is protecting by restricting, that you're not giving them an opportunity to communicate as much because you've sort of shut it down.
No, that's different, because it's not that you're stopping them from going off and doing things, because they are going off and doing things.
Right.
It's just in the terms and the framework that you're talking about and addressing e-safety is within those restrictions. It's a very different thing. It's not that they're being prevented. It's not that they don't know how to get by those filters and those blocks, and it's not that they're being prevented from going into communities and discussing things and signing up for services that perhaps people wouldn't want them to be doing. It's that the way that this element of it is being addressed is thinking that that's a boundary thing that is controllable. So if I've got a school and I've got a blocking and filtering policy, which many schools in the country do, some schools have mobile phone bans, many schools prohibit access to social networking services, for example, I'm able to deliver e-safety advice and guidance in specific ways that aren't actually extending into the services and practices that young people are actually engaging with.
But that's because the school, so that's the difference between an official formal context and what the kids are actually doing.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the institutionally, the staff might imagine that they're really good at e-safety, but they've kind of sort of missed what's actually happening, or it's kind of offset from what's really going on in the students' lives.
I think, well, there's two key things from a school's perspective. One, if I'm a head teacher, and as I said before, some of my pupils are cyberbullying each other on these sites outside of my school time and space, I can still have a parent turn up at my school and ask me what I'm going to do about it. It doesn't limit my responsibility towards my community by not having access on site. And the other thing is that you know, the research shows that the approach limits opportunities and potentially limits the development of digital literacies and skills around those areas. And if you've got young people who don't have access to devices and support outside of a school setting, then actually reflecting a bit more what the world is like for those young people as a whole becomes much more important within a school setting. But it's a very complex area because it obviously has a lot to do with liability and responsibility and young people, and it's not an area that people are comfortable totally with, but really part of the message that we're trying to support schools in is looking at much more education around young people taking control and responsibility for their own activities and their own actions, rather than making that dependent on kind of limiting their access to different things. Okay, so So those are some of the kind of key things that came out of the survey in terms of the priorities and their priorities in terms of these are the action areas that we're looking at now and these are the areas that we're taking forward. Obviously the first three you can imagine are fairly generic, but I think they're important to take as a set. So we've got staff doing amazing things and we really need to support them in getting the word out a bit more about doing those amazing things and sharing those things, because very often things happen within a school setting and that's as far as it goes. But obviously we want to benefit our other school communities and we also want to benefit wider school communities too. So it's really important to look at focusing on promoting the work that that group are already doing. Entry-level staff have been very resistant to our approach, and that's because our approach is very lightly scaffolded and it depends on mainly them having the confidence to develop and design and take things forward. And if you've got no idea about an area and you're very nervous about an area, that's not going to happen. Self-directed staff development, the school-based and focused activities have been fantastic. They've been ambitious, they've been really high impact, they've had really, really good results on whole school communities. So it's an area that we do want to continue with and that we're working on at the moment. Contextualisation of e-safety guidance and work we've talked about a bit here, and it's an area that we want to continue to look at and work with the schools over, because it's all of this work is not about quick fixes to things. It's about changing embedded cultural practices in organisations, and that takes time and it takes persistence. And then the last point there is something that we're working on at the moment, and we're going to release some work around next week, which is around the use and knowledge of open education resources. We've got categories in the survey around, for example, creating and sharing, which you would imagine school staff would score really highly on, because I'm doing that every day in terms of my practice. I'm finding stuff online, I'm using stuff online, I'm sharing stuff online. But actually they scored not as highly as you'd imagine them to do, because those areas explicitly mention things around copyright, around open licensing, around finding and using open educational resources at the higher levels. And the message back from the schools is that we've never heard of an open education resource. We don't know what this is. We don't know what Creative Commons is. We don't know what an open license is. And that's obviously related to a degree of nervousness around copyright in general and copyright education in general. So one of the things that we're doing is working around that area to produce advice and guidance to support staff in understanding more about copyright as a whole, but also to very practically support them in being able to find and use and create openly licensed education resources too. And that obviously helps us support those pioneer people, and it also helps us share and produce and focus on materials to support those entry-level people as well. In terms of the project impact as a whole, I'll just wrap up quickly with, well, what have we achieved in the 2 years? We've done huge amounts, I've already talked to you about in terms of actions and activities, obviously, but it's not just busy work, it's not just us doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff. Some of the things that are really important about this project is that it's introduced and started to develop that notion of a shared understanding of what we mean by digital literacy and practice, and without that, people can't move forward. If they don't know what you're talking about or what you might be hinting at, they can't take steps to move forward or have conversations about what that means. All 23 schools have engaged with us over the course of the project, something we're really, really proud of. At some schools we had 100% participation in the survey. We've had activities and events from all schools too. Projects represent significant cultural change, particularly in the way that we are looking at staff development in relation to the use of technology in the school sector. So it's not pinned down to specific, how to use iPads or how to use specific programs or specific systems. It's actually taking a broader look at the kind of backbone skills and areas around that. Montfort University and is looking at adapting and adopting our framework and using that in terms of their staff development work, and some other universities have been in touch as well to look at using that. And I think what kind of is interesting to outside people about this is, yes, if I'm working in the secondary school sector, this is really handy to use kind of out of the box, but for other sectors it represents a process and a structure and a tool set that's actually very adaptable and customizable for those different areas, whether that's looking at learners or whether that's looking at HE staff. We've shown statistically significant change in staff confidence over the period of the programme. And the other thing that's really important about this project that Richard mentioned right at the beginning of the video is its situation in open and connected learning. Everything that we've done from the project is openly licensed. Everything that we've supported schools in producing through the project is openly licensed, and that's introduced a lot of staff members and a lot of schools to open licensing, because if we're saying to them, please put an open licence on it, and they're saying, well, what's an open licence? People are learning quite a lot in that context, but obviously that's a little bit limited. We're going on with the OER work to do more. But without that element of it, we're not going to be able to connect as educators to others, and we're not going to be able to get the kind of reach and scope that we want for the work that we're very proud of in the city that staff are creating. And we're not going to help them connect to wider communities of practice, and not just connect globally, but actually connect locally within their schools, within their city, to other educators as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.